Welcome to History Explained. On this episode, we will be discussing how the Civil War fundamentally changed America. The Civil War is a war that will always be remembered for a negative reason. A strong, unified nation turned against each other in the North and South and fought to the death because of social, political, and economic differences. The North and South disagreed on matters such as the acceptance of groups in society, even if they were supposed to be free. However, the North and South both came together to form a nation of industry after the South's economy was destroyed in the war. The Civil War fundamentally changed America because it united America in its economic system of industrialization. However, the war ultimately failed to unite America as a whole when it concerns the societal views and action towards former slaves. The economy in the South changed from agriculture to manufacturing after the war, and the South eventually joined the North in manufacturing, which led to the Industrial Revolution. Before the war, the Southern and Northern economies were very different from each other. The North's economy was based around shipping and manufacturing, whereas the South's economy was based around slaves working on plantations and the growing of cash crops. The South could never engage in industrialization before the war because their money was usually tied up in their land. The South's economy was self-sufficient and the plantation owners relied on free work from the slaves and their viable crops, therefore the South never had to participate in industrialization. During the Civil War, when the North was dominating in 1864, William Sherman and his army started an uprising called Sherman's March, where he and his men started in Georgia and pillaged everything in their path, such as animals, buildings, crops, and even towns, all the way up until they reached North Carolina. A woman who lived in the South during this event, Eliza Francis, stated the fields were trampled down the road and was lined with carcasses of horses, hogs, and cattle. Battles and events such as these ravaged crops and plantations in the South and made the land temporarily unlivable for Southerners. After the war ended in 1865, the North's industrial economy was still very strong. However, in the South, the war had wiped out all of the farm machinery, livestock, and left thousands of acres of land uncultivated along with cotton. When the war ended in 1865 and the South rejoined the Union, they had to figure out a new economic system so that they could restore their way of life because their main exports had been wiped out. During Reconstruction, steps to diversify the economy popped up, such as textile mills and the manufacturing of tobacco in the South. However, the North still had a much higher income. The South started to shift to industrialization because the North was making up so much profit from it, and the South was desperate for a new source of economy. This ended up leading to the Industrial Revolution. America fundamentally changed after the Civil War because the South joined the North in manufacturing and created a nation of industrialization, leading to the Industrial Revolution. The Civil War also fundamentally changed America because it failed to unite both the South and North to accept African Americans and give them equal opportunities and treatment after they were free. Before and during the Civil War, there were fights over the disagreement of slavery in the North and the South. The North felt slavery was morally wrong, whereas the South felt slavery was their equal right to have personal property, such as slaves. Every time the North tried to abolish slavery, the South felt threatened. During the Civil War, the North, along with Lincoln, fought to give slaves the freedom they deserved, and there were many Supreme Court cases, such as the Dred Scott case, a slave who was brought into free territory for several years, then returned to the South with no owner and was fighting for his freedom. However, there was still hostility towards slaves, so the verdict was that slaves don't have rights of citizens. They are property. This ruling motivated Lincoln and his troops to give the Emancipation Proclamation, which was a strategic and political speech that motivated troops to win the war so slaves could have freedom. After the Civil War ended and the South surrendered, the slaves were officially announced free in 1865 by the 13th Amendment, stating neither slavery nor servitude shall exist within the United States. The people of the South could not own slaves, however, they still showed hostility towards them and were not accepted in Southern society. Right after military troops were taken out of the South during Reconstruction, Southerners started to show the hostility to the African Americans, again socially and politically. In a town called Opelousas, located down south in Louisiana, there was a social inequality like the Black Code. Section 6 of the code mentions that no African American shall be allowed to preach without punishment in the town. Furthermore, Section 1 mentions no groups of African Americans are allowed to have group meetings after 10 o'clock, and failure to follow the rules will result in whipping and jail time. African Americans were mistreated by society just because they were given the right to be free, and the South would not accept that, unlike the North. African Americans were also given obstacles to overcome before they could have a say in politics. To prevent African Americans from voting, many special qualifications had to be passed only for African Americans, like a tax in order to vote. The tax prevented many African Americans from getting a say in who they want in office, unlike all of the Southerners who got to vote and have a say of who would benefit their interests. Once some of the African Americans met the requirements to vote, they still had the challenge of dealing with clans in the South, such as the KKK, which started in Tennessee and tortured free African Americans, so they would be too intimidated to vote. Abram Colby, an African American, describes his interaction with the Klan as when they took him out of bed and took him to the woods and whipped him for 3 hours. Though free, African Americans were said to be given equality, however, were intimidated and not able to have equal opportunities in the South, unlike the North. The Civil War fundamentally changed America because it failed to unite both the North and South together in treating African Americans humanely and equally after they were announced free. To wrap up today's episode, in conclusion, because the war ruined the South's farming economy, it drove them to manufacturing, which ultimately led to the Industrial Revolution. Also, after slaves were announced free, after the Civil War, the North treated them as equals, whereas the South were still not accepting of them and treated them inhumanely. The Civil War fundamentally changed America because it united America in its economic system of industrialization. However, the war ultimately failed to unite America as a whole when it concerns its societal views, political actions towards African Americans.